questions and answers. So recording is now in progress. Okay, we'll get right started. The first paper is Progressive Path Dependency by Jacob Powell of Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Jake, take it away.
All right, let's see if I can figure out how to do this here. Make sure I do it correctly. All right, give me 1 second. So I think you can see the presentation, yes?
Yes.
All right, well, happy to be here. Nice to see some people, in the age of COVID, even if it's virtually. So today, talking about progressive path dependency, question mark. When an academic puts a question mark at the end of a title, they always know the answer. So, hold on to your seats. Overview, just going to talk about motivation, path dependency, couching it in original institutionalism, and then thinking about cumulative causation, ceremonial encapsulation, and then the implications for how we think about policy implementation in light of some of these things. And then I'm going to move to ultimately argue that we can use rhetoric as a way to implement progressive economic policy and try to create a state of progressive path dependency. So the real motivation for the article is trying to build a bridge between two camps of original institutionalists that were really debating at the end of the 80s and early 90s between coming out of the Ayers tradition, Foster, Mark Toole, and Paul Bush, kind of focusing on instrumental value and promoting instrumental value through institutional change. And then the Wendell Gordon and Mayhew kind of camp saying we need to account for culture beyond as just imbecile institutions or something to be overcome. And I'm really going to try to use path dependency as a conceptual entry point and try to elucidate, can we think of ways in which we can implement what we might deem progressive economic policy that could form a progressive path dependency? I know often those words aren't put together. When we think path dependency, we think suboptimal, but can we think of it differently? So initially, I'm going to be brief because I think a lot of this is just review for most of us. Path dependency, the term is typically associated with Paul David's article in 85, Clio and Economics of Qwerty, where he argues a path-dependent sequence of economic changes is one which important influences upon the eventual outcome can be exerted by temporarily remote events, including happenings dominated by chance elements rather than systematic forces. Essentially, what David's arguing is that history and historical contingencies matter and can override profit maximization or efficiency maximization tendencies attributed to the market by orthodox economists. The three factors he really highlights that lead to a path dependency are technological interrelatedness, economies of scale, and quasi-irreversibility of investments. So again, David's highlighting some technological and pecuniary factors animating path dependencies. And in the latter part of the paper, he discusses irreversibility due to learning and habituation and gives brief reference to Veblen. Now, the idea of path dependency is not new to original institutional economists. I cited a couple of papers that kind of have looked at this phenomena through an institutionalist lens, ultimately arguing that original institutionalists are uniquely situated to more comprehensively understand the factors animating path dependencies. But again, as institutional economists, as Mayhew said, all aspects of socioeconomic systems are subject to the process of cumulative and path-dependent change. So from that perspective, all institutions with staying power take the form of a path dependency to an extent due to habituation, right, in this larger process of cumulative causation. And I have this long quote from Veblen that I won't pain anyone by reading, but essentially the point is we're studying cumulative causation, which is this ongoing process of these intersections of habituations over time. So from that perspective, the way I kind of see cumulative causation as a broader concept that we're studying as institutionalists, but cumulative causation could also be looked at as an interlocking of many path dependencies in ways. And it is our goal to study this process as institutional economics, as Veblen argues, and why economics is not an evolutionary science. So it's interesting to me is why does path dependency often have a negative connotation? If it's a phenomena that is ever present and that we're studying, why does it always have a negative connotation? And the reason is because there's often an implied suboptimality from an original institutionalist perspective due to a degree of ceremonial encapsulation, typically past binding ceremonial encapsulation. I'm drawing on Bush's 87 article in coming to that conclusion. So path dependency and ceremonial encapsulation, again, that suboptimality attributed to a degree of ceremonial encapsulation, eroding instrumentality, whereby network effects, technical or behavioral, create a state of irreversibility. But all new ideas and technology have a degree of ceremonial encapsulation as they're socially embedded. There's no such thing as a purely instrumental new idea or technology with no state of ceremonial encapsulation. And to deem something that has some level of ceremonial encapsulation suboptimal or not progressive seems too strong of a criteria, right? And from a certain sense, nothing could be optimal or progressive from that perspective. And so when we're thinking about progressive institutional change, typically the way it's defined is coming from Mark Toole's discretionary economy, where changes that facilitate the continuity of human life and the non-invidious recreation of community through the instrumental use of knowledge. Now, the word continuity in here is really important because it harkens back to Foster's principles of institutional adjustment, specifically the principle of minimal dislocation, that all institutional modifications must be capable of being incorporated into the remainder of the institutional structure. This implies both ceremonial and instrumental aspects. When we think about minimal dislocation, there's really two aspects. There's one aspect that regards unintended consequences. Foster said, when we have institutional change, we need to make sure that earlier instrumental institutions don't become undone or replaced by ceremonial. And the second aspect is really understanding that we're habit creatures. This is like an evolutionary ontological commitment. We're habit creatures. Revolution isn't ontologically consistent. We can't do what we do not know how to do, and there's no such thing as wiping the slate clean. So from this idea of minimal dislocation, then the question becomes, well, is progressive institutional change possible if we're always having to make sure there's a level of minimal dislocation? And I would argue absolutely it's possible, right? As Bush argued, institutional regards a change in value structure whereby instrumental behaviors replace ceremonial. That doesn't mean there's no more ceremonial. There's just a progressive replacement or increase of instrumental behaviors relative to ceremonial. Now, how this process plays out will be influenced by the degree of ceremonial dominance at that time. But the more that we can replace, the lesser we can lessen this index of ceremonial dominance. Okay, so what does this have to do with policy, or how do we think about policy from this perspective? Again, the path dependency literature tends to focus on technologies or tools, we might say, right? Technology, I think for original institutionalists, is a broader concept. And policy is a little different in coming up with a new technology insofar as it often needs majoritarian support in a democratic context, and it needs an aspect of legitimation to ensure that that policy isn't overturned next political cycle. So the question becomes, so from this kind of conversation so far, if we're trying to implement progressive economic policy, should we start by undoing ceremonial habits of thought, debunking myth? And I would argue no, we can't start here. We need to account for these ceremonial habits of thought beyond just imbecile institutions to be suppressed or overcame, but think about how can we co-opt them in this process of implementing progressive change, right? Again, once we recognize ceremonial encapsulation is inevitable to a degree, we need to account for these things. Because if we start by trying to undo ceremonial habits of thought right out of the gate, attacking culture and these kind of foundational aspects of people's worldview, we're likely to garner cognitive dissonance, which is a violation of the minimal dislocation principle. When we reveal habits of thought as mythological, often it leads to a recommitment to these habits of thought, both at an individual and institutional level, right? This is cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is the midwife of the status quo. It's the antithesis of change. So if we start by trying to undo these habits of thought, we're only likely to garner cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance, in my mind, is related directly to ontological security. The way I think about this really comes from Claude Levi-Strauss and Anthony Giddens' work. And Levi-Strauss has this great chapter, this first chapter of his book, The Savage Mind, where he essentially argues myth and science are different in kind, but similar in function, in the sense that they order the constellation of phenomena we engage with each day, thus mitigating the arbitrariness or this tyranny of arbitrariness that we need mitigated to act. And mitigating this arbitrariness at like an ideological level, what it does is it forms a sense of that's not spelled right, but ontological security is what Giddens coined the term. And that ontological security, that sense of security, not questioning every single thing we're doing or seeing everything as arbitrary, is necessary for action and thus provisioning. So there's a functionality to these ceremonial habits of thought from this lens. And again, this isn't a new idea. I mean, Durkheim's Elementary Forms of Religious Life, one of the main arguments was that religion facilitates group connectedness necessary for group provisioning. Paul Dale Bush highlights the ceremonial rituals around canoe building for the Trobenders and how that facilitated that process at an instrumental level. And so cognitive dissonance from this perspective is really a psychological protection mechanism to maintain ontological security. And we want to avoid that. Oops, I got jumpy there. All right, 1 second here. Let's get back to where we were. So in thinking about ceremonial habits of thought and how we can account for them beyond imbecile institutions of progressive economic policy, we first have to start is what do we need to implement progressive economic policy? And I would argue we need majoritarian support to facilitate legitimation and to mitigate the index of ceremonial dominance. And rhetoric can be used as a tool to co-opt ceremonial habits of thought or play into them to achieve these ends. And so we can use rhetoric to try to weave through this ceremonial net to garner majoritarian support for a policy by reframing them. Douglas Brown, in an article in 1992, argued we should use the rhetoric of rights and democracy. And he recognized that the rhetoric of rights, or this commitment to rights, is grounded in a ceremonial foundation, but it is the terrain or field of modern discourse in a democratic society. And by meeting people on the field of discourse, which they're pre-reflexively wedded to, and thus predisposed to be sympathetic to, we have a higher probability of garnering support. Right? And he ultimately argued we need to promote the rights of equal participation in our rhetoric in an effort to subordinate corporate profit rights. Another theorist who's with us today, William Waller, my colleague, talked in a series of articles about how we can use the rhetoric of reciprocity to do the same thing, to try to weave through this ceremonial net, recognizing that reciprocity itself also is a ceremonial, has a ceremonial like wedded to it, or people are wedded to this idea of reciprocity on ceremonial grounds. But we can frame policies in a way to highlight reciprocity to try to get people to come along with us. Policies that are direct violation in people's minds of the reciprocity principle often aren't implemented, as Waller shows. So one example is I was in a class and one of my students was like, I didn't need my stimulus check. And I responded, sure, but the business you spent it at did. And then by highlighting that reciprocity or the economy as an ecosystem, that student starts to rethink how they think about this policy or support for this policy. So that's rhetoric in terms of garnering majoritarian support, but we also can use rhetoric to help form legitimation. By playing into ceremonial habits of thought, which are often the foundation of that legitimation process, we can help garner legitimacy and thus facilitate staying power so that the policy can't be overturned in the next political cycle. Again, ceremonial habits of thought are instrumental insofar as they facilitate legitimation and thus create continuity. Continuity, again, being part of Toole's definition of progressive institutional change and part of Foster's principle of minimal dislocation. The alternative is to demand pure instrumentality likely to garner cognitive dissonance, or as Brown argues, to take on an authoritarian practice and an almost Lenin vanguardism that's likely to lead to, when you take that authoritarian measures, not likely to facilitate legitimacy or legitimation, and thus likely to continually have to divert to authoritarian measures to maintain the policy in place, ultimately declining democratic institutions. We can also think about one of the goals of progressive policy is to mitigate the index of ceremonial dominance. The index of ceremonial dominance is mitigated in this approach by using rhetoric to move policies that are instrumentally feasible and ceremonial non-feasible, which is the set of loss instrumentality, to ceremonially feasible. Again, I don't need to undo their habits of thought. I just need to reframe the policy, not change the policy, but reframe it as a way so that it adheres to their ceremonial habits of thought. Now, will there still be ceremonial encapsulation? Yes. And will there be some lost instrumentality? Yes. For example, Waller highlights the massive bureaucratic apparatuses that come about to catch welfare cheats in an effort to maintain some reciprocity principle. But the question is, if we didn't play into those ceremonial habits of thought, would those policies have ever been implemented? And is the state before implementation more instrumental? Yes or no? I think it'd be hard to argue that it's more instrumental without having these, social safety net. Moreover, if ceremonial encapsulation aids in the legitimation process, then there's a level of instrumentality in that ceremonial encapsulation. Now, one of the problems we run up against with this approach is the problem of reification. By playing into ceremonial habits of thought, are we reifying insidious institutions? And Janice Peterson and Ann Jennings have two nice articles in '92 where they highlight how the rhetoric of paternalism has been used to implement welfare policies directed towards women that's ultimately reified patriarchy. So this is a real problem. But from an evolutionary ontology, all behavior is reifying to a degree. So therefore, we need to choose ceremonial habits of thought best situated to help undo these insidious institutions and lead to the non-invidious recreation of the community, like reciprocity, like rights doctrine. I think both are uniquely situated to do this, to mitigate the level of reification. Once the policy becomes implemented, notice there's been no change in value structure yet. We haven't tried to change the habits of thought yet. We've just tried to play into them. Once the policy's been implemented, what'd you say, Bill?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, I got it. Once the policy's been implemented, the level of instrumentality will become revealed through its material benefits to people. And over time, support that was once founded on ceremonial grounds could theoretically shift to instrumental grounds, ultimately replacing ceremonial behaviors with instrumental behaviors, which is the definition of progressive institutional change, right? Bush says these change in these objective circumstances will change the material conditions and thus the habits of thought. So what does this mean in the contemporary context? If we think about the Affordable Care Act, why was it so hard to repeal in the US, even when the Republicans had the presidency, when they had the House, when they had the Senate? I would argue part of it has to do with the material benefits of that policy being realized and making it so difficult to be reversed. Now, has it been eroded? Absolutely. But it's hard to argue a state before the ACA is more instrumental than with the ACA. When we think about government stimulus checks, they were effective in propping up aggregate demand to the point where I think a lot of us would argue they should have been bigger. Will people expect to demand these in the future? If we think about a job guarantee, we hire everyone ready, willing, and able to work. If we can get that implemented, what politician is going to be able to stand up and say we're reversing that policy and throwing millions back to a state of unemployment? Now, some might say what I've argued here today is conservative or reformist, but society is made up of both conservative and dynamic elements. We need to account for both. We're habit creatures. Incrementalism is the foundation of institutional policy. The alternatives are revolution, pure instrumentality, or abolition, all likely to lead to cognitive dissonance and thus no change. A radical theory must yield change. So in conclusion, we're approaching institutional change by thinking about culture as more than imbecile institutions, trying to wed these two camps of institutionalism, and think about how we can co-opt these institutions and ceremonial habits of thought to aid in progressive institutional change. Ultimately, the whole argument, we're accounting for culture, utilizing reciprocity rhetoric to weave through the ceremonial net to implementation, whereby instrumentality is revealed through the material benefits. Over time, constituents become wedded to these material benefits, mitigating the ability to undo the policy and creating a state of progressive path dependency. Now, this progressiveness is temporary, as progressive is a time-variant construct, but in that moment could be seen as progressive and thus a lock-in. So thank you all for listening. It was wonderful to get to chat some ideas. I look really forward to seeing what other presenters have.
Thank you, Jake. Our next paper is going to be presented by Wilfred Dolfsma. My experience is we all change the titles long before we give these papers, so he can tell us the name of his paper. Go ahead, Wilfred.
Thank you, Bill. Let's try to make sure we have, you can all see the PowerPoint slide that we have. Yeah, all right. Yes, let me start by saying indeed that the title of the paper changed a little bit over the course of the last couple of days, I should say. And that relates to the other caveat I should mention. We've not been able to finish this paper in time due to some personal circumstances. And so this is pretty much a work in progress, and I'd be really happy to get whatever input you can share with us. And us in this case is Ioana from Lucian, Blaga University of Sibiu, and myself, Wilfred Dolfsma, Wageningen University. So we added a little bit of basically a primary title, because what we're trying to do is to look at why certain institutions might persist, even though circumstances change. And so in that sense, I think we kind of are very closely in line with what Jacob has just been talking about. but we're using slightly different terms, institutional economics terms nonetheless, but still slightly different. And I'll tell you exactly why and how that pans out. So this is a table of content. So the key things here are, I guess, that we look at society and markets, both of them, as evolving evolutionary systems, and we try to spell out in the paper to be that institutions are selectors, so they select the kind of economic behavior that are deemed appropriate in society, in the economy. But these institutions are themselves selected by social cultural values in society at large, or part of that. We talk a little bit about the labor market, just to stay close to our own experiences. We stick to the labor market for academics. So this is really the kind of the picture that we start off with. It's something that I've been talking about in the past a little bit. So we have the social cultural values. These give rise or allow for an institutional setting, institutions, and these institutions kind of allow for, give rise to, give direction to the behaviors, evaluations. I called it in this 2004 paper, including economic behaviors, economic activities. And the key thing to note here is that we kind of define institutions at the level of what is allowed in terms of behavior. So we kind of separate the social cultural values from the institutions, and therefore, if depends a little bit on how you read somebody like Del Bush, but it appears almost that in that thinking, the social cultural values and the institutions, they really align, and when they change, they change in tandem. Well, the key point here is that we think it's also very valuable to very good to think of those two things to not change in tandem, but to change separate from each other. And that's what was tried to spell out a bit more in this paper from 2008, where you see that when you have an established towards the left, an established values and institution systems, a new set of values can start to clash at the level of the values, and then something new can arise. So the prime values prime, institutions prime, or there can be a clash at the level of the institutions, or there can be a clash at both combined situations. And then the question is, which of those three possible situations arises, and how does that tell us something about what will happen afterwards? But I must say that this whole kind of picture seems to still suggest that there is alignment between what the values and the institutions combined. Even if so, when there's a temporary clash at the value levels or at the institutions level, at some stage, not too soon afterwards, these two start to align again. Well, and as I was talking with Ioana over the last couple of years in relation to other things that we do together, it's struck me that maybe ultimately, in the long term, as Keynes put it, they might align. But who is this Vietnamese general who was supposedly said that, when he was asked, what is the impact of the French Revolution? And he said, well, it's too early to say. Well, maybe we want to say something before 2,200 years elapse. I want to say something about what happens when the sociocultural values for a quite a long time don't really align with either other sociocultural values in a society or with the institutional practices. So we looked at a situation of the labor market for academics, which I think can be characterized as a labor market in which increasingly over the years, over the decades perhaps, non-academics values have come to be playing a role, social cultural values playing a role in this setting. I would say increasingly maybe commercial values, maybe positivist values in more recent times, maybe values that you could relate to merit, etc. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And my point is, in maybe in Western European countries, in North American setting, that process has been quite or relatively gradual, right? We all feel the pinches. And certainly, as I been just spending a couple of years in the UK, I certainly sense that there's a lot more commercial social cultural values in that institutional setting of higher education. But the pinch has been very acute and very painful in a post-communist setting. So very quickly, a whole set of social cultural values and also to some degree related practices have been implemented in a country like Romania. What you see is that a very mixed picture, and I'm not sure if we should talk about it in terms of ceremonial versus instrumental, because the newly implemented or the newly adopted and sociocultural values from say Western academia, I'm not sure if we would all say these are instrumental. But what happened is a situation in which so the science, and let's focus on economic science, the communist parties, before they've seen the transition, they very much were subscribing to a set of values that were where the science was supposed to be contextual, right? So whatever one had to say in terms of economic science, it has to be, it had to have a societal impact that was relatively local or regional, and certainly not supposedly universally applicable. And these kind of contrast with the universalist, with the positivist kind of approaches, but I refrain here from putting say quantitative versus qualitative, but because if you look at, for instance, the history of institutional economics, then you see that we have been accused of being too quantitative, too quantitative, particularly in the post-World War II era, by what was, by our, scholars who you would now say are mainstream scholars. So it's not quantitative versus qualitative. It's more, I would say, societal impact and contextual versus universal and positivist. But on the other hand, there's also another thing involved with this transition that I think the more, say, Western countries have gone through more gradually, and Eastern European post-communist countries have gone through more gradually, which is, and that could be considered maybe a good thing. So a system whereby there was a change from one in which you'd be if you were to subscribe to the value of loyalty, then that was something that was being valued. And if you were given some sense of appreciation for the value of merit, that was not necessarily something that was appreciated in those circumstances. So, for instance, when I visited Romania very shortly after Ceausescu had been thrown out, I was talking with some new friends who were studying economics over there, and they, for instance, showed me their textbook, which ran along the line of, and I couldn't read any Romanian then, but I could understand. So they would say any topic, would say, well, Marx has said this, the following on this. Lenin has said something else, then Stalin said something, and then Ceausescu said something, and that was the final thing. And as long as, and then you would move on to the next topic, and as long as you would, show loyalty in your thinking and your behaviors to whatever was stated, that would be appreciated. And so you have this set of social cultural values that also academia in those circumstances would adhere to, and they kind of contrast with the social cultural values that were, you could almost say, potentially imposed on academia over there. And we all, if we've lived through enough time, we all know what happened then by exporting textbooks, etc., to post-communist countries. So that's at the level of the social cultural values, I think, and I hope we see that contrast between different value sets. But you can also see that at the level of institutional practices, where a set of related institutions define what is the behavior to show in that setting. And there you see over the years, I think, and I'm not sure about your experiences, but certainly in my experience in Europe, you see a struggle over how to translate the different social cultural values in academia into ways in which to find a way to appreciate the activities and the outcome of the activities in terms of research and in terms of teaching. So so do you are actually the policy advices that you give to the government, are these appreciated or not? Well, in my country nowadays, it used to be a case for economics when you would make a career giving advice to the government, which is societal impacts. So that's the kind of values that are being promoted, and contextual, right? Because if you give advice to a government of a country of some 18 million inhabitants, that's certainly something different from if you give advice to US government of what is the current number of inhabitants. I don't want to be amiss in that sense, so let's not even guess there. But nowadays, it's at most a nice add-on, right? So the way in which you measure relevant output is by the number of articles, number of citations, and maybe not even all articles counts, but you better hide some articles even if you publish them. So that's the kind of a struggle that I think we can all hopefully relate to. And I've tried to phrase it in terms of how that connects to the social cultural values. But you can also, I think, see it in teaching. And it relates to the context, the level in which you are contextual in your teaching. You have societal impact with your teaching, but also the extent to which teaching has become a commercial endeavor. Right? It's not so much the case in the Netherlands yet. It's much more the case in the UK, but the Netherlands and other mainland European countries are also gearing up, for instance, by making sure that we teach, especially at master level, in English. So that's a small change in the practice, you would say. By the way, many of the colleagues have big big problems with it, but it's a way in which you try to change the institutional system by trying to favor some values over others. So I would say it's a way in which this thing plays out. So trying to wrap up quickly before Will starts to warn me about the time I have left, and also I'm running out of arguments. Hopefully we will add something in the days to come. But we try to kind of raise this beyond the situation for the academic labor market, where we try to say, well, how come some institutional institutional circumstances, institutional settings are really obsolete, and we suggest a couple of things here. First of all, the social cultural values are maybe multi-interpretable. So there's not a very clear connection between the values and the institutions. That kind of is what I read into Dale Bush's work. The other thing is that the institutional settings, institutional practices are not perfect, and I draw here a little bit on Jeff Hodgson's work. I have a paper myself on how these imperfections might play out. The third thing is the imprinting of the institutions on behaviors might be imperfect, right? So the way in which the institutions prescribe behaviors is not a one-on-one situation. And then, of course, institutional practices are not insulated from other practices. So, and that can be played out. And some of these practices might be more or less informal, so that you have these formal and informal institutions that kind of give wiggle room for interpretation of what the institutional setting actually demands of our behaviors. And this kind of feeds into some literatures that we've tried to hint at a little bit. So there's literature in mostly in sociology, or in institutional entrepreneurship, which I think is very relevant to have a look at. So these come out when the links between the different levels and the level of specificity at each level. So values, institutions, practices, and behaviors. When these are when there's wiggle room there, then entrepreneurial individuals can try to either to shape the space or to push the boundaries a little bit. Obviously relates a bit to the imperfect learning. That's one way of putting it. I hinted at the work of Durkheim before, who talks in his book on suicide on anomie, where he talks about a disconnect between the values that are connected, that are subscribed to more broadly by society, and the values subscribed to by some individuals, which might lead them to commit suicide. Well, I think there's a broader case to be made there, where maybe some individuals, they kind of depart a bit from what is being adhered to in a broader society, but they can try to persuade people to join. Okay. So yeah, I was afraid of that. So let's come to conclusions. So we talked about values of selectors of institutions as selectors of behaviors, and how these selection environments might be less than perfect. So that situations can occur where institutions from a past that aligned with different social cultural values perhaps continue to persist. We try to illustrate that a little bit with respect to the academic labor market, and hopefully we can draw out some more general conclusions, conceptual conclusions, even in this paper. But as I see it, it's kind of maybe some research also to pursue in some more distant work after this this paper. And so I'm very keen to make sure that we get some very thought-provoking input from you. So here's my email address if you want to share it later than in this session. But we're keen to engage with you, because this is something that we hopefully will be pursuing in the next couple of years to come. So thank you very much for your attention. The floor back to you, Bill, and let me stop sharing then.
Thank you, Wilfred. Is Ali Tarhan here? He doesn't show up on the list of participants. So Paolo, we'll have you start next, and you can tell us whether your paper has changed in title or not.
Well, yes, it has slightly changed. The original title, the original subtitle was what economic ends are desirable. It has changed to what about institutional change? So, it links to some concepts that were introduced before, because actually the point of departure for my paper was cognitive dissonance. The cognitive dissonance of some colleagues that during past conferences were particularly frustrated about the way they conceive of the economy and the way the economy is actually working. Better said, well, we all acknowledge that over the past decades, societies have become ever more unequal. Job and income precariousness has increased. And nevertheless, economic schools of thought that downplay the importance of these issues remain dominant. And even worse, a great many people, including the losers, support governments that maintain and reinforce this situation. And so this led to some exclamations during previous conferences by some colleagues who thought, well, is there no way out of this situation? Is a radical change a possible and possibly the only solution? And pushing the argument further, what about a revolution? So I start with this question, and the first thing I have to say is, when we think about a revolution, the first thing we think of usually is, and here I link to the Vietnamese general, we think about storming the Bastille. But is that really what a revolution is about? Actually, the storming of the Bastille occurred only following a set of premises. I will only mention two. One was a cultural premise, that is to say, the Enlightenment, which changed the culture of the country. And then there were some economic problems, the monarchy's inconsistent goals concerning, on the one hand, the need to finance the modernization of the economy and to maintain military effort on the one hand, and on the other, the need to avoid taxation to maintain social peace. So you do not have a revolution unless you have these premises. Then you eventually get to what is called by some authors a conjuncture. That is to say, a moment when you might say you have the explosion of the revolution. And typically it's represented in the case of the French Revolution by the victorious clash of the Estates General with the monarchy, which was very soon followed by the storming of the Bastille. But still, after that, you have a follow-up. And the follow-up after the revolution was, after the storming of the Bastille, was that different revolutionary classes had different outlooks on the future, and they started splitting up. And so the outcome was anything but certain. So what I try to point out with these few comments is that when we think about a revolution, actually, we have to think about a complex process rather than a palingenetic change. It involves dealing with the present as part of a historical process. And in this sense, if we look at today's case, it means trying to understand how neoliberal society has evolved. And on the one hand, so a look at the past. And at the same time, how to pursue a better future through purposive change, which is looking at the future. And in this sense, looking at the present as part of a historical process. Now, let's look at these two items, the last two items I pointed out. And let's look at neoliberal change. Neoliberalism has affected the economy, certainly, by introducing an institutional change in favor of price-centered coordination, what we call market centrality. It has shifted the economy from output-centered to money manager business. It has determined a regressive redistribution of income and wealth. But it has not, neoliberalism has not affected only the economy. It has affected industrial relations, for instance, by shifting the balance of power in favor of managers and financial intermediaries, whereas before there was an alliance, so to say, between managers and employees in many countries. It has determined precariousness in terms of jobs and income. Neoliberalism has also affected culture. It has emphasized the role of individuals that evermore has homo economicus rather than citizens. It has returned us to what Polanyi would call called our obsolete market mentality. It has reaffirmed what Michael Sandel calls the tyranny of merit. And so a further change has been in social relations, in terms in that it has led to ever more in-group, out-group dynamics and the demise of solidarity. It has increased hate crimes against a variety of minorities. It has determined a law and order syndrome. And all of this has determined what I was mentioning before, a sort of a consensus and an ideological hegemony of neoliberalism, despite its financial instability it has determined, and despite the failure of its macroeconomic rules. So, given these features of neoliberalism, which transcend the economy, what does purposive change mean? The typical a typical approach that many would follow, and I believe in some sense appears here in our discussion, is interdisciplinarity. Basically, there are disciplinary boundaries whereby there is the economy, other social dimensions, each one has its own rules. And if we try to understand what is going on in the economy, typically a failure, some failure of economic policy, we can look at it in terms of either economic policymakers getting it wrong. They don't understand some technicality, or they miss some technicality. Or in the other, another case is simply that there are extra economic reasons, the interference of extra economic institutions, which is up to other disciplines to explain. Now, if we look at neoliberal policy, we feel that there's something wrong with this approach. Neoliberal policy did not merely change economic and extra economic institutions. It changed how the economy affects society's institutions. It changed industrial relations, social relations, culture. And it changed how society affects the economy's institutions, how people understand the labor market, people's expectations about their social mobility, the scope for social infraclass antagonism as opposed to solidarity. My impression is that interdisciplinarity is at a loss because it cannot account for the changing systemic interaction, that is to say, the shifting boundaries between the economy and society. Furthermore, the fixed boundaries of interdisciplinarity tend to constrain our foresight of a possible society within the bounds of the status quo, because it prevents us from conceiving of a different economy and a different society. So what does this lead me to suggest? It leads me to suggest that a proper understanding of these issues requires an open systems perspective, which assumes that interaction among sections of society involves feedbacks, and these feedbacks change both the internal and the external dynamics of those sections of society. This means that disciplinary boundaries are neither watertight nor permanent. It means that if we look at something going wrong with economic policy, it may still depend on policymakers getting it wrong, but it may also depend on the fact that economists fail to acknowledge that the economy changed. It changed values, thereby affecting behavior. It changed the balance of power among social groups, thereby affecting the interests at stake and that have to be defended for social and economic stability. It affected the degree of freedom that people have to understand their reality, thereby affecting democracy. And it has affected the way people act in the pursuit of their individual and collective goals. In practice, it has affected their freedom. So the open system perspective is nothing new. It has come to the fore over the past recent decades in methodological discussions. I think about Sheila Dow, Tony Lawson, these kinds of contributions to economic thought. But it actually dates back to institutionalist authors like Lucian and KEPE. And so I think it might be worthwhile to look back at these authors and at how they may help us to understand the economy. In sum, I don't think that an open system perspective will revolutionize the economy, but it may help us to revolutionize our approach to progressive economic change. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. Our next paper is being presented by Sarah Klammer, for her and her co-author, and she can introduce the title.
Yes, it will just be me, but Eric's here for questions after. Let me make sure I can actually share this correctly. All right, does everybody see it?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so I'm Sarah Klammer from Michigan State University, and I'm presenting a paper I wrote with Eric Scorsone, who most of you are familiar with. This paper actually ended up being more of a case study than a broader paper about instituting a human right to housing that our abstract alluded to. We're looking at a case study of a proposed right to housing in Sacramento and analyzing whether it's a right at all and what this means. So this is actually our first applied paper using Eric's and my new model for institutional impact analysis, which we're pretty excited about. So any feedback you guys have is much appreciated. So we'll start with a little bit of background about the broader situation before diving into the model and the case study. So in this case, our situation is well known. We've heard a lot about this at the other sessions. The pandemics led to widespread job loss and increased financial insecurity. The Census Bureau's Pulse survey for October showed that 15% of renters were not caught up on rent payments. These numbers are likely to be an underestimate. The 2020 annual homeless assessment estimated that over 500,000 people experienced homelessness on a single night in 2020. And while it's possible that aid has helped alleviate this spike, since this trend started pre-pandemic, it seems likely to continue, if not worsen. So this is a big problem for cities as increased evictions and homelessness accelerate disease transmission. Unsurprisingly, the end of moratoriums brought with a spike in COVID cases and mortality. This is a greater issue in areas with large homeless villages, like the city of Sacramento, where villages have developed in busy areas that the city has been unable to control. And this creates interdependence with the shop owners and other people in these downtown areas and the homeless. This is on top of all the other challenges faced by homeless populations in cities, of course. So what can be done about this? Obviously, stopping the eviction crisis at its source is perhaps the most obvious solution, but incredibly complicated, as we all know. The CARES Act provided some financial aid to households, as well as enacted eviction moratoriums, but these are ending or have ended. This was all short-term, of course. So a longer-term solution can be found in establishing a human right to housing here in the US. This is hard to define what a right to housing is, but for our paper, we used the UN's definition, which defined a right to housing as including 7 broad characteristics. These included security of tenure, availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. So a human right to housing includes more than just one right, it's many parts of a bundle. So this right historically has not been supported federally, but there are some state constitutions and local governments that express some support under statutory law. So there is a glimmer of hope. Sacramento's response provides an interesting case for looking at these supposed attempts at establishing a right to housing. So we'll look at that. So Sacramento has been hard hit by the affordable housing and eviction crisis. The city estimated that between 10,000 and 11,000 individuals experienced homelessness over the course of 2019. That is a huge number. The vast majority of these individuals are originally from Sacramento or are long-term residents of the city. And the city has been unable to enforce anti-camping laws due to a court decision of Martin versus City of Boise, which restricts the jurisdiction's ability to move homeless individuals if there aren't adequate shelter beds in the area. And in Sacramento, there are not. During COVID, the health department also restricted the city's ability to move individuals to help restrict spread. So we're going to look at the Sacramento case using the legal economic performance model that Eric and I developed in our book, and that book is actually due out in March. So this is a plug. Please check out the book. The LEP model focuses on the issue of human interdependence as it can be analyzed using Hofeld's taxonomy of jural relations. So this means that we compare alternative structures in Hofeldian terms of rights, duties, privileges, and exposures, among others, before considering economic and other performance outcomes. And I'll show you what the jural relations look like on the next slide. So this model may actually look familiar to those of you who have used Alan Schmid's situation structure performance model. And that's because it is. We actually are building from that, but using Hofeldian legal analysis to build out the structural part of the model, which becomes really useful when we're talking about rights, like a right to housing. So this is what the Hofeldian jural relations look like. Every entitlement has its unique disablement borne by some other party, and that's the key. So you can have a right and a duty on one person, but not for the same thing at the same time. There's always somebody else on the other end of the stick. Every unique relation is also limited by its opposite, but since we're pressed for time, we're just focusing on the correlatives. Oops, sorry. So the LAP model starts with an assessment of the current situation or status quo. And we've talked a lot about the situation in Sacramento already, but to recap, currently in Sacramento, there is no right to housing, and this is true across the United States. In other words, no duties imposed on government or other officials to provide housing. And it's estimated that over 5,000 people on any given night are sleeping outside or in campsites in Sacramento. So they don't even have half of the necessary shelter beds to house these individuals. The homeless have the privilege to camp. The city and the citizens are exposed when there aren't enough shelter beds. And this privilege is limited by their duty to stay off of private property, which owners retain the right to. And so that's what's resulted in them camping in public areas. And of course, again, due to Martin versus City of Boise, the city also has the duty to not enforce anti-camping laws, and homeless have the right to not be moved from public property under those laws. So the city's proposed solution to this problem is the comprehensive plan to address homelessness. This plan includes sites for shelters, shelter beds, greater amenities, and even permanent and semi-permanent housing. The mayor is pairing this with what he calls a first in the nation right to housing and obligation to accept. Now, we know from Hofeldian jural relations that a right always comes with a corresponding duty on someone else. In this case, the mayor is proposing a right and duty on the same people, which we can use the legal economic performance model to try to untangle. So now the structure part of this is filled in. Notably, we can see that Sacramento isn't proposing a right to housing as we might think of it broadly at all, but rather a right to shelter, likely temporary, as defined by the city. The housing the city is providing is actually pretty variable as of the last plan I reviewed, ranging from additional beds and even tents in designated homeless areas to semi-permanent apartments and tiny homes. The city has the duty to provide some kind of shelter. Nonetheless, under the plan, it just might be a tent. Under the plan, homeless individuals also gain a duty to accept shelter or move if the city demands it. The city now has the right to move them where they see fit. The city also has the privilege to enforce all of this, and homeless are exposed to their methods. The city has said they won't use police fines or arrests to force removal, but many groups remain concerned, especially since they haven't detailed the alternative method of dealing with moving people if they don't want to go. So if the ordinance is passed, homelessness in Sacramento will likely decrease for the population that has previously resided in the city. Whether or not this is going to be sustainable or if they'll be back on the street again is unclear. The transient homeless populations are likely to remain unchanged from current levels, though these populations could now be moved into targeted areas of the city under the anti-camping protocol. This means that the change in homelessness will be largely dependent on the makeup of the population in these two groups. The latter transient population is unlikely to benefit from the rule change aside from increased access to temporary shelter beds. And of course, the benefits will be entirely dependent on quality of the new resources and whether these individuals choose or are able to use them. The quality and sustainability of the shelters and amenities is largely dependent on funding sources. The plan seems to rely on many temporary or one-time sources of funds, including American Rescue Plan money, but they have indicated that some state and federal funds are going to be set aside in future, but it's all very vague. Finally, forced removal is a negative potential outcome many are very concerned about. Not everyone wants to move, especially if their options are group homes or part them from pets or other belongings. The mayor stated again that there will not be criminal and civil charges brought against those that refuse housing, and that they plan to use non-police to enforce, but this does not ensure a harmless implementation. So in sum, the city is attempting to shift legal relations by instituting both a constrictive right to housing with a duty on city government to provide such housing and a correlative duty on those without housing to accept or face removal. We conclude that the added burden of exposure to possible forced removal, in addition to the temporary aspects of the housing, would undermine attributes of a housing right under the UN's definition, and certainly under many others. It's also unclear whether the ordinance would provide a solution to homelessness over the long term, as it does nothing to address the issues of growing housing insecurity among the population. So I'd like to end with a quote from Eric Tars, an attorney who worked on the Boise case. He's been really outspoken about his concerns about the Sacramento plan. Basically, without expanding permanent low-cost housing in the city, he doesn't see how the plan will address the issues of the affordable housing and homelessness crisis in the long term. And certainly our LEP analysis, while not comprehensive, highlights these same concerns. It seems unlikely this plan will have sustainable results toward actually resolving homelessness without expanding emphasis on permanent housing solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next paper is by Konstantinos Loizos, and I will allow him to tell you what the new or same title is.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my PowerPoint. Is it okay? You can see it?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Konstantinos Loizos, or the short version is Kostas Loizos. I'm from the Center of Planning and Economic Research and National Kapodistrian University of Athens, Greece. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present today. And my paper is about the institutional change in the context of a reconstitutive dialogue between the original institutional economics and late Douglas North. This is an ongoing research project, so I want only to stress some essential points in this debate, and I would very much appreciate your comments and suggestions. My approach to the debate between North and the original institutional economics puts the emphasis on the old unsettled question: when we are about to explain institutional change, what should causally precede, individual agency or social structure? My argument in a nutshell is the following. Original institutional economics start from an holistic viewpoint and late North from an individualistic one to meet each other in individual cultural embeddedness. Bridges have been built, but I think more is needed. A synthesis between the original institutional economics and late North is possible if we think about institutional change as being grounded on two foundations. First, a reconstitutive action, which is collective to be effective, and this is the original institutional economics holistic part. And second, a reconstitutive thinking and cognition, which is individual by its nature, and this is the Northern part. So exploring their interlinkages might shed new theoretical light and inform policies for social reform in a political economy perspective. Now, let me start with North and the problem concerning the individual. In late North, ideas and beliefs condition choices in different societies with different cultures. Ideology pertains to subjective models to explain the world, and North's institutional individualism acknowledges the interaction between individual action and social structure. Eventually, the agent of change is the individual submerged in institutional constraints. But of course, neoclassical remnants are still there. Relative prices, self-interest, efficiency of organizations, and a debatable deductive approach to history. Eventually, the dichotomy between Homo economicus and Homo sociologicus is still there. Now, on the other hand, the original social economics and the problem concerning the collective entity, Veblen, according to a strand of literature, in Veblen, habits of thought and incentives affect learning and new technological knowledge, and of course, institutional change. Yet ideology of the social group as discipline is not challenged by individual adaptive rationality, or at least it's not clear how this might be done. In commons, political and judicial processes in the context of a notion of public good relate to institutional evolution. Change in habitual assumptions and adaptive rationality are related to problem solving, yet it is not clear how the interaction mechanism between revision of habitual assumptions and changes in practice or thought really works. In original institutional economics, institutions are both constraints and instruments. Now, examining agency and mental models in original institutional economics, let us have a look again at causalities first. Instinct as a basis for capacity of language, which is culture-specific communication and interaction. Individuals form intersubjective relationships, shape institutions, and institutions condition habits and cognitive processes formation, which in turn inform individuals' mental models. Hence, Veblen's agent-structure interaction as irreducible and independent entities. There is, of course, a cognitive dimension of institutions which relates to likely behavior of others and its interpretation with shared mental models, but cognition is cultural. And in fact, structure does not only constrain, but also alter individual powers and propensities. In fact, in this two-way interaction between individual behavior and institutions, I think that the revision of beliefs conditioned by changing habits of thought is the key. And of course, praxis, action and consciousness of agents is reshaped by contradictions, including non-adaptability and divergent interests. Contradictions lead to praxis, which is political agency for change, which is closely related to collective action. Yet, how contradictions are perceived by individuals is crucial. Now it seems that we are getting somewhere, but what about North? What about the cognition problem in North? The relationship between structures and actors is a mental process, according to North. Alternatives are constructions of mind, which lead to intentional choices and institutional change, and so, in this framework, intentionality is the key. Patterns of thought are individual perceptions, not corresponding accurately to reality because of continuous change and uncertainty. Hence, beliefs are continually challenged. The mind responds to confirm or modify patterns. Pattern formation is unique to each individual, but leads to shared beliefs, that is, a collective interpretation. From an embedded actor, we end up to an actor with identity. Individuals have the capacity to learn and change, and this leads us from the individual to the meso-level collective, individuals in the relationship, and the macro-level society. Now, a step forward. Is it possible? I think it is. Individual has a role to play as the basis for cognition of external circumstances and the bare evolution. Yet, reconstitutive action is sustained only at the level of groups of individuals or collectives, organizations, which are possible due to shared beliefs. Institutional change requires both of them in a complex interaction, since policies can only be addressed to purposeful groups. Individuals participate in many such groups with various and possibly conflicting goals. Intentionality relates to the choice of groups and collective action. Revision of beliefs conditioned by changing habits relates to changing group memberships, which might alter the balance of political power. Revision of beliefs is a product of such complex interaction, but cannot be transformed to reform of institutions unless it becomes the object of sufficient collective action. However, sufficient collective action is not possible without persuaded individuals. Therefore, North's cognitive emphasis on the individual is crucial, but it can only realize its full potential within original institutional economics' emphasis on cultural embeddedness and collective action. In this context, cognitive processes take place in a context where the ultimate causality runs from socially determined habits of thought to individually realized revision of beliefs. Looking at institutional change in this way might provide us with a more convincing explanation why the same contradictions, when perceived by individuals that form multiple collectives, do not produce the same results in different historical and cultural circumstances. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would appreciate your suggestions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all being reasonable about your time. And I believe we have now actually a fair amount of time to talk about these things. So if you'll indicate to me in the chat or just put up your little hand thing or wave your arm around, I'll recognize you and we can have a conversation.
So if there isn't a question right now, I had one from Dr. Tawhid. If you mind if I answer it, he directed it to me privately in email or in chat.
Could you tell us what the question was?
Yeah, I'm going to read it out. Yeah, I'm going to read it. So Linwood said, in education, cognitive dissonance theory holds that the teacher should strive to evoke cognitive dissonance in order to motivate students to challenge their beliefs and to arrive at a more fact-based opinion. This is consistent with Dewey and Peirce, where exposure to new beliefs that conflict with the old beliefs cause a discomfort which spurs change. Rhetoric, as you point out, becomes the vehicle by which change can be motivated. And what I said to that was, yes, absolutely. The goal is still to facilitate replacing ceremonial habits of thought with instrumental. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be an educator. And in the classroom, I think it's our job to constantly evoke cognitive dissonance. I'm actually giving a presentation tomorrow at KEPE specifically on pedagogy in this process. But in that classroom, it's a different space where they have a facilitator to help guide them through that cognitive dissonance and come out the other side. And thinking about policy, if we approach it through cognitive, like invoking cognitive dissonance from the outset, it's a different space whereby they don't have that facilitator necessarily to help them get through that cognitive dissonance to the other side. So in the classroom, debunking myth absolutely should be our goal. Cognitive dissonance, reflexivity, pushing those ideas and making those students uncomfortable. But in terms of trying to garner majoritarian support for policy, where they're not in that space with a facilitator or a space where cognitive dissonance is encouraged, we need to try to play into ceremonial habits of thought to get them to come along with us. So I just thought I would address that really quickly. Great question. Thank you so much.
Paolo?
Yes, thank you. Two brief questions for Jacob. Out of the so many ideas that he put out in his presentation, I could barely follow them. The first one is you lay a great deal of emphasis on meeting people on a rhetorical values, which tends to stress a sort of ideological field of interaction. I wonder whether you are not, in a way, undervaluing, not taking proper account of actual economic concerns and the fact that one might act on those to change things. In other words, let me give you an example. There has been some discussion in a previous session concerning racism and how we ought to deal with it. And one way to deal with it is ideological. That is to say, getting people to change their mind about racism. Another one that is based on economic concerns may be to induce a lot of white people who believe that they gain an advantage relative to Black people, to realize that they may have an advantage in allying with Black people against a governing majority, which is carrying out policies that are against their interests. In other words, why don't white workers and Black workers unite against white capitalists rather than white workers ally with white capitalists against Black people? What I'm trying to say is, why not think about economic interests rather than just ideology? This is the first question. The second question is, I tend to believe you underestimate authoritarian rules. First, authoritarian regimes may arise precisely as a response to cognitive dissonance. And this is what basically Polanyi teaches us about fascism. It is because there is no way out of the contrast between market values and societal values that there is that fascism comes about. And when it does come about, it determines values. If you go to Iran, to Algeria, after what happened in terms of the regimes that were established by Islamic groups, you see that people have changed. The same has occurred in Chile after so many years of dictatorship. People have changed their minds. So it is not that easy to say that an authoritarian rule is not effective. It may well be. The examples I suggest are dramatic, but I think they may be worth thinking about. Thank you.
Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. I'll take the first point, or the second question first really quickly. I completely agree with you, like what you said in terms of how these authoritarian regimes do have these, they might use authoritarian measures from the start, but then these ideological mechanisms start to erect by where the minds change and they become legitimated, right? And that argument on terms of like, what I was trying to make the point on the authoritarian was Brown's article. Douglas Brown makes this point in his article that in thinking about progressive change, we can have Lenin vanguardism, which is often going to need authoritarian mechanisms to get implemented, which from a goal of progressiveness shouldn't be our goal, because it will not facilitate the legitimacy necessary to maintain democratic institutions and thus continually rely on authoritarian mechanisms to maintain the change that the vanguard deemed progressive, right? So what I'm saying is, for those in Chile, or the authoritarians that you mentioned, they're fine with whether they garner legitimacy or not legitimacy, even if it takes time, because they have no incentive to maintain, or no, core values if you're authoritarian to maintain democratic institutions. Us, in thinking about progressive institutional change, if we do have a commitment to democratic institutions, then we must think about garnering legitimacy through rhetoric rather than diverting to authoritarian measures to implement that progressive change. I hope that distinction is clear, but I totally with you, Paolo, in how over time authoritarians do change minds and can legitimate themselves. On the second point, in terms of am I too in the ideological field? What about the real economic concerns? One point out of the gate is just due to space constraints within this paper. I already blew past my word count. If this was more comprehensive, there'd be a section on how economic crises create the material conditions that ripen the ideological field for change in a way, right? That we're up against these hard barrier material constraints like climate change, racism, sexism, patriarchy, inequality, and so forth. And that in those spaces of crisis is the time where we have the most potentiality to co-opt that rhetoric in creating change. And then in terms of the ideological and material, I think in my mind, and again, maybe this was a space constraint, but in my mind, these are inseparable things. And I think this paper is animated from that perspective, that you can't separate the material and the ideological. And that to go at the ideological through the rhetoric, as you call the ideological, you are going to have effects on the material. So for example, in terms of playing into cognitive or playing into people's habits of thought, I come from a very poor, rural, working class town in upstate New York. Almost every person I know is a Trump supporter. And most of them are white male, like blue collar hard hats of like the 70s that used to be all against capital and capitalists, and now they support Trump. And I'm always blown away by this. So when I talk to them, I could come in and say, and again, these are also people very predisposed to racism, right? I could come in and start saying you're a racist, which they're going to shut down and tell me, you know, I'm done talking to you. Or I can say, you care about working class people, right? We're working class people. We come from a working class community, and kind of play into their ceremonial habits of thought that they're wedded to this like working class identity, and then say they're also working class people too. They're the ones that don't have power. The person of color is also working class. They're on our side, not with that silver spoon-fed baboon in the office, right? We don't like people with silver spoons in their mouth. We're working class people. Let's identify with other working class people, right? The corporations have the power. And what I've noticed in those conversations is I can get them to come along with me. We're like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, yeah, we are working class people, and start to form that kind of solidarity that you're pointing to, Paolo, on a material ground that can lead to change. My point is, when I go to talk to them, I can't lead by calling them a racist, which they are, right? Which they are, because then it's over. The conversation's done, and there's no potentiality of garnering that solidarity necessary to facilitate that material change.
Jake,
But if I
we need to move on.
Okay, I'll stop. I'm sorry.
Linwood had his hand up. We'll go to Linwood, and then there's a question from Manuel Lutz, and we'll go to that afterwards. Linwood.
Yes, I had a comment and a question for Costas. But this is all going to be kind of in a framework of asking the question of why original institutionalists need new institutionalists at all. Because it seems to me that, for example, if we look at Veblen's idea of an institution as settled habits of thought, the settled is a social part, but habits of thought, like thinking in general, only happens in individuals. Society doesn't think, individuals think. So there is very much an individual in Veblen's idea of an institution. It's even more explicit in Commons, this idea of collective action, expansion, control, and liberation of individual action. The individual is explicit in Commons' idea. And the new institutionalists have taken much of Commons' ideas, most of it without attribution, although Oliver Williamson has given some credit. But it seems to me that the new institutionalists are a deformed subset of the original institutionalism, and therefore original institutionalists do not need new institutionalist ideas because they are already implicit. Or as my teacher, James Sturgeon, would say about new institutionalists, what's new is not good, and what's good is not new. Original institutions do not need new institutionalists. And one more point, North's idea of an institution is rules of the game, which is, Commons is working rules. But in addition, North's idea of an institution is that it is a constraint on individual action. Well, Commons says that his idea is institutions control, which is constraint, but it also expands and liberates. That is, it's only a subset. And Commons also wants to look at how institutions constrain some but benefit others.
Thank you. Manuel, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Could you respond to Linwood and also the question in the chat, which is basically OIE foundations present a critical standpoint regarding market sociability. North is quite the opposite. He was an apologist of market order. Consider North's participation in the Mont Pérelon Society, just as an example. How how to handle convergence considering these important differences. Go
That's a
ahead.
question. That's a question.
Yeah. There indeed was a, oh, that's your question.
That's
Yeah.
my question. Yes, it's just
Oh, okay,
that.
same one.
Okay.
Costas, would you like to respond? Costas,
Yes. Excuse
do
me.
you want to respond to the question or?
Let me see it because well, I'm not familiar with this literature.
Like you,
I can make it more clear, I
Yes.
think, because I see that North and original institutional economics have difference in an ontological level, because we can see that there are some methodological convergence, as you are presenting in your paper, but in an ontological level, the role of market in original institutional economics and on North perspectives are really different. There is a big difference on that. So when you read North, even the new North, as you are presenting, there is always an convergence on an objective to an apologetic perspective on markets, that markets solve everything. So in original institutional economics, this ontology of market does not exist. So we can understand that we have vested interest and other stuffs that make markets. And this is very different there's a big difference between North and original institutional economics on the ontological ground. And if we stay in this methodological comparison between both, we do not arrive to this difference. So my question was about how to handle this difference in the ontological level and in the methodological possibilities for convergence. That's it.
Understand. Well, I think I would agree with you in the previous comment that I realize that you also North is probably in a sense a subset of the original social economics, and maybe we can see it clearer in this perspective. So the ontological differences might indicate that the original social economics have more sound grounds on this issue, while North, in a sense, is not so firm in this sense. So, however, I think that if we want to gain something from North, is this cognitive emphasis, because in North, this cognitive emphasis is not well grounded because it is not linked to the formation of habits. But on the other hand, I think that the original social economics need more elaboration on this aspect, that is the aspect of cognition, the aspect of persuasion, the aspect of forming beliefs, which are related, of course, to the formation of habits. And this is what I wanted to stress concerning the possible convergence or the possible submergence of North into the original social economics.
Thank you. Anna, you had your hand up. Do you have a question? Anna? Okay. The next person with their hand up was John Watkins. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on North, and I put this in chat that I agree with Linwood. And the following quote seems to me a concession to OIE. quoting North, the subjective and incomplete processing of information plays a critical role in decision-making. It accounts for ideology based on subjective perceptions of reality, playing a major part in human beings' choices. The odd thing about North, of course, or maybe not so odd, and I agree that he's an apologist to the mainstream, bringing together, synthesizing rationality and the idea of transactions costs. But his definition of efficiency is really reveals his value system, in which efficiency, is defined as those institutions that will maximize economic growth. And that certainly differs from the OIE.
Wilfred? Oh, go ahead, Costas.
Okay. Yes, I agree with that. You're absolutely right. But I think, again, that the last turn of North concerning his cognitive emphasis puts him more closely to the mentality of the original structure of economics, even if he does not realize that, even if he maintains his neoclassical remnants.
Agree.
Wilfred?
Yeah, I have a question or comment on something else. So unless, okay, for Eric and Sarah, so I really very much both like the conceptual framework that you develop, and also I like the application to the housing market, homeless situation in Sacramento. Maybe also because I've been volunteering, helping out towards the homeless in where I live, which also struck me as something that on a conceptual level might be relevant for you. So what I think needs filling is a pretty big jump between the legal framework to the performance outcomes. I think there's a lot of stuff in between that you can also fill conceptually. For instance, there's a legal framework in both the country and the municipality and also the region towards the housing market and towards how to try to make sure that, even if they don't want to, the homeless are not too bad off. And that's really involved in where I live, and that involves working very closely together between all kinds of parties in the local circumstances, and as and when for instance the weather changes. Now we have winter protocol, for instance, on, and then an entirely new set of institutions kicks in, right? We have the health authorities driving around to places where we know that people who don't want to live in a house are taken away because otherwise they would freeze to death. So there's and they're brought to us and we take care of them unless they don't want to, and then they are off again. So there's a lot of behaviors and also institutions, formal as well as informal, in between the legal framework, the formal institutions, and the performance outcomes. How the house market works, how society deals with homeless of different kinds, and so I think conceptually there's also a gap to be filled.
Yes, and that's certainly the most difficult part when we were developing the model, was sort of filling in the conduct role. And what we ended up doing in the book is there's actually like the conduct that feeds in to the situation and the current interdependence, right? And then you can look at the different institutional structures that you're interested in, but obviously you make that choice. Then once the structure is in place, there's conduct again, and you'd have to really work with people and like immerse yourself in the situation, as Commons would, suggest, to understand what you think conduct might be. I
was indeed also thinking about the structure common performance literature out there from the industrial organization, right? So not the game theory part, but I do think that the conduct that we're looking at is institutionalized. So it's not as if, you know, every player, whenever they face a new situation, they look at the legal framework. Oh yeah, this thing is what I might be doing, and then let's do some calculation. And then I show conduct, and then some kind of performance comes out. No, the conduct actually also is institutionalized.
Yep, there's the rules for making rules, and the other, you know, other rules that all feed down into that. And I think it was on the chart that I showed. But I was trying to keep it pretty simple so I could fit it in the time frame.
Oh yeah, sure.
But we would try to, you know, refine this more if we were able to write a longer paper.
Well, maybe I should also look at and carefully study your book then.
Well,
Thanks.
I think you'd enjoy it. So yeah, check it out.
Thanks.
Yep.
We still have quite a bit of time due to the absence of one author. Does anyone else have any comments or questions they'd like to make?
So there was a question from Avi in the chat.
Avi?
Yes. Hi.
Go ahead.
So I posted this in the chat. This is for everybody, presenters, non-presenters too. There seems to be, when we're discussing ceremonial encapsulation, at least a missing discussion of intersectionality, especially when we're talking about the way in which these pre-existing patterns of dominance are maintained. So I guess my real question is, when we're talking about progressive institutional change, when we're talking about ceremonial encapsulation, do we also need to have a discussion of the matrix of domination from sociology as part of that discussion, as part of understanding why certain technological developments may or may not generate the progress that is promised?
Would any of the members of the panel like to address that question from Avi?
I'm happy to. I know I talked a lot about ceremonial encapsulation. I think the answer is absolutely yes, right? Like, you have to have a comprehensive conversation about matrices of domination through an intersectional lens in any discussion of progressive institutional change and in ceremonial encapsulation. I mean, one of the reasons I didn't cover it explicitly in my paper was one, like, again, time constraints and space constraints. The other is I'm kind of like zooming out to like just ceremonial encapsulation in general, rather than the different forms of ceremonial encapsulation. I would argue some are relatively benign, others are very non-benign, right? The ones that you're alluding to, Avi, in your question. So yes, and the answer is yes. To have a conversation about what is progressive institutional change, you have to have a comprehensive understanding of the matrix of domination. And I think from my perspective, that goes both into the policy formation itself, and then also in the political mobilization for that policy, right? So.
Okay, Farouk, you had a question earlier. Would you like to pose it to the group?
Yeah, thank you. Just a question or remark for Konstantinos in relation with the arguments developed by the Austrian approach of polycentric governance. That states that we can imagine the regulation system in a society through the more local community-based organizations without requiring the intervention of the monocentric state supervision process. And then they argue that it is more flexible, more efficient, and more freedom respecting. So do you think that the use of this kind of polycentric arguments might be of any use, any utility for the understanding of the evolution of institutions when you study North and original or classical traditional institutionalist approaches?
Well, I think there is a relationship between the parts and the whole. So if we think of the parts as the many groups or organizations that people participate, and they are members of these organizations, and different people are members of different organizations, and they form beliefs through their participation. in these organizations, but there is, of course, again, a balance of power among these organizations of different levels, which eventually affects the political superstructure. So I think that at the level of the different organizations, then we might think of changing beliefs or changing mentalities and the formation of different ideologies. But eventually, the collective action that takes place and give rise to the change in the political scene and the governance of the state, et cetera, is important. So there is a connection between these two at different levels, of course.
Alicia, did you want to say something? No. Okay, John, you have your hand up.
Yes, this is for Jacob, and I was just hoping, could you expand on the idea that revolution is inconsistent with social evolution? I understand that guiding institutional change is facilitated by the absence of revolution, but there may be times in which revolution appears the only alternative.
Yeah, this is always a fun, hairy territory to get into. I think like the basis of it, and I think of like Jim Sturgeon as my professor talking about this a lot, and like an evolutionary ontology is that, and he was always, usually when Jim would talk about it, he'd always talk about Foster's principle of minimal dislocation, right? That we, at an ontological level as evolutionary economists, we recognize we're habit creatures, and habit creatures do what they know how to do, and they can't do what they don't know how to do. And I think the way that I'm saying it's inconsistent is the sense that revolution, in my mind, and this might be too strong of a definition of revolution, right, implies like a rip in the fabric or a discontinuity like in the social fabric that isn't possible from an evolutionary perspective. The social fabric is continuous at an ontological level and seen as continuous at an ontological level.
Well, I'm reminded of, Veblen's point that if people are confronted with pecuniary exigencies, that they may be forced to change. Now, he doesn't use the term revolution, but I infer from Veblen's comments that it could be construed that way.
No, I think I see that, John, but I also think back to like when I read the end of like the last chapter of Theory of Business Enterprise, where I think Veblen's saying we're coming up against these exegeses, but I think there's also this implicit argument in Veblen too that like we also can't tear the social fabric. We can't tear like the cultural fabric to devolve to like a brave new world or something beyond.
Well, I agree that that the state or the society that follows the revolution often continues, the many aspects of the culture that preceded it.
Yeah. And I think that, I guess that's what I'm getting at is I'm taking this really strong definition of revolution where there's like this separation, this hard cut. I think, once if you lessen the definition of revolution or like come off of that hard definition I'm using, maybe problematically, then I think radical change is definitely possible. And I think material conditions can facilitate radical change, like the crises we're running up against now, like COVID-19, like the pecuniary exegeses that we're facing currently are creating material conditions where some level of radical change is going to have to happen. Whether we call that revolution or not, we can debate, but there definitely has to be some radical change.
Yeah, and even war.
Hold on, John.
Could be construed as
John,
revolution.
hold on a second. Paolo, you seem to want to interject here.
I would like Jay to explain what he means by social fabric, because it reminds me a great deal about what we have at the individual level, that is to say, self-identification. Now, I identify as a lot of things, and most often they tend to be inconsistent, mutually inconsistent. My typical examples are that I can be an army officer and at the same time maybe a Christian. And so on Sundays, I pray for peace among all of our brethren. And then on Monday, I plan a war against those same brethren. And I may be a breadwinner who has to work all day long, and at the same time a father who wants to take care of his children. So this applies to society as well. I mean, we are a society is made up of very different things, and it may have a great deal of different fabrics. In some instances, some may be very compact and others may be very loose. So I'm not really convinced that you can speak about situations where the social fabric is broken. It may be broken already. Think about the 6th of January of last year. There definitely was a breach in the social in some parts or in some dimensions of a social fabric. Other aspects remained compact. So if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? Like, what is the social fabric? There's a multiplicity to it. On the January 6th thing, I would say, like, yes, one can see it. And again, I think this is a rhetorical point. Do we see it as a tear in the fabric, or do we emphasize the staying power of the democratic institutions holding up and the election going the way it did and those type of things? You know what I mean? I think, like, it's almost where we choose to focus our attention determines whether it's a tear in the social fabric or not. In terms of the self-identification, just a quick point and then I'll stop. The self-identification and the constellation of inconsistencies that make up our own identity, and thus we also see the same thing at an institutional level. What I think is interesting for kind of the argument I'm trying to put forth is that there's a logic that we come up with that's not the logic of the, Bourdieu always says, that's not the logic of the logician, but it's logical to us, where we rationalize all these inconsistencies into a coherent whole. And I think we do that at both the societal and institutional level. And for me, I'm trying to understand, what is that logic by which we're rationalizing all these contradicting forces? And that is really the discursive field that we need to enter to try to create progressive change. But before we can enter that discursive field, we need to try to understand that logic. But honestly, Paolo, I think it's a great question. And John too, I need to think more about this. I'm playing with some new ideas here and really need to also kind of work some of this out and write some of this down.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left. And this is a very interesting discussion, so we can continue to use it. I'd like to apologize as the person who put the word limit there that is constraining all of you, but it is generating a really interesting discussion. Is there anyone else who hasn't asked a question who'd like to say something? Then I think I will call this session to a close. We can all go take care of personal needs before the next one. Thank you very much. This has been great. To all the participants who gave papers, thank you for being so conscious of your time.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.